Ladies and gents, time to look at the old Mistweaver. We expected a lot. We asked for a lot. What did we get in return? How is it playing? Can you roll it? Is it viable? Is it the bench class? A phrase that is flying around the internet right now. Is it the bench warmer extraordinaire? Or is it in fact completely cool and awesome because it's fun as fuck to play? How is it actually working out for us? Now, one thing I need to say here is, although the footage in the background is of course a Mistweaver, healing when numbers are being changed all the time and showing that is not easy. It's not easy. In fact, it's nigh on impossible. And the reason for that is because numbers directly affect how you play, you tend to play inefficiently when numbers aren't quite finished. And the reason is that is if you don't play inefficiently and with a slightly altered playstyle than what is maybe intended, people die. And unlike DPS who can do lower DPS and tanks who might be able to get away with a couple of mistakes, if you let people die, you're going to have a bad time. So you tend to play to what works rather than what should be. Does that make sense? I hope so. So I have thrown some Mistweaver in the background there, but it certainly doesn't represent how this thing plays in a raid, and probably doesn't actually represent how it will be played in a dungeon. I'm just making you aware of that so you don't start getting confused by seeing a lot of things like enveloping mists and all that kind of stuff. You play to what keeps people alive rather than an intended style of play. That's just how it goes in betas when numbers are changing all the time. So, what were the problems in MOP that we wanted to get rid of? We don't want to be the overhealing kings anymore. Quite frankly, I don't want to be the king of healing the people who have full health all the time and just being like, uplift. Ah, my Renew Mist landed on the wrong target. Ah, fuck. And all that kind of shit. That's not what we wanted. We wanted control. That's all. Mistweavers wanted control because their major problem was that they just had little or no control. Heavily reliant on where Renewing Mist decided to go. Did another healer snipe that? Absorbs were obviously a huge problem in Mists of Pandaria. So a lot of Mistweavers just hoping for less overhealing, really. And the fact that they could be more effective. It's great that you can churn out ridiculous HPS. It's not quite great when that HPS is just going into the ether. So a lot of the changes requested by players were fixes to that. Did we get that? Did the Mistweavers get that? Not really. Not really. No, sadly. And in fact, they've undergone several talent changes. And more recently, I gotta make you aware of this, guys. Honesty is always the best policy. Is that the Mistweavers were relying on a bug up until today, as I filmed this video. A bug with the PvE sets that were making them viable. Yes, I use the word viable. It's not great. What happened? What happened in Walls Drano? One, AoE healing was mad nerfed. It was crazy nerfed. It was hit with the fucking hammer. And unfortunately, that meant that one of the big sources of healing that Mistweavers has, which was Uplift, was greatly affected by that. Now, they have to give that a huge buff to try and bring Mistweavers back in line. One of the other aspects that has altered is Renewing Mist absolutely heals for dog all. And it was odd that Blizzard actually gave out a quote. With healing, it's always difficult for me to get a grasp of it from playing it myself in such a limited environment. So I speak to the other Mistweavers that I know, and the feedback they were giving me was that they were really, really confused by the feedback Blizzard was giving them. They were just like, why are you saying these things? So in regards to Renewing Mist healing for absolutely nothing, the response Blizzard gave was, well, remember, Renewing Mist hits 3 targets. So you can't just look at the numbers of one Renewing Mist and say that's really weak, because you've got to add it all together and got to take into account that it spreads around and it's healing 3 people for that amount and all that kind of stuff. Now, obviously, there's huge fucking issues with that. There's a lot of issues with that. One, that you don't control 2 of the Renewing Mists, and the potential there for it to go to waste is there. And the fact that other healers can easily spam direct control on their hots, such as Rejuvenation and Renew, onto targets that specifically need it and keep that completely under control, and they tend not to run into huge mana issues, and that's just crazy. And you can't compare them, but Blizzard is doing that, which has then created this issue where Renewing Mist heals for bog all. Now, they've tried to fix that, by changing one of the talents, which allowed you to drop healing spheres wherever you wanted in combat, which was glorious, by the way. I actually thought it was fucking brilliant. They've changed that to pools of mist, or mist pools, or pooly misties, whatever you want to call it, which just, I mean, so boring. Your renewing mist now has 3 charges, meaning you can blanket a raid pretty easily, and of course it heals for 15% more. Woohoo! Talk about a band-aid fix at best. My good. My friggin' good. Which is a shame, because the other level 100 talents are actually very cool. Chi Explosion is not bad for the old Mistweavers, and because it drops also 8 healing spheres, which you can then detonate with your Detonate Chi. And put out a little bit of burst there. Very, very nice. And on top of that, your healing statue, which actually swings around and follows you, is very cool visually. Really very cool, but seems to not be putting out anywhere near as much numbers as we would like to see, certainly by the actual current numbers on the beta, which is all I can base things on right now. Of course, always subject to change with these videos is the actual numbers, so maybe we'll see that. But as it stands, the default go-to, especially for Mythic, is going to be Pooling Mist, more than likely, because you can just blanket a raid and then maybe your uplift will do more. On the back end of that, though, sorry guys, it's really bad news. It's really bad news. Uplift now has like a cap on it, a really severe cap with huge diminishing returns, meaning if you do blanket a raid, it again heals for piss all. It just fucking flitters in the wind, and it's quite sad really to see that. Now, having said that, I just told you that Chi Explosion is actually pretty cool, and what this meant was that if people were very clumped up, Mistweavers were actually quite competitive, and are quite competitive if people are all stood on top of each other. If you're doing things like Chi Explosion mixed with Detonate Chi, and you can mix in other abilities while you stood completely still and people are gathered around you and doing a lot of spinning crane kick and all that kind of stuff, then you're actually alright. You actually put out very, very solid numbers. And of course, Dis isn't as powerful anymore. Absorb's not as powerful, so overhealing somewhat has been brought down. The problem is when people start spreading around for the reasons I just talked about, which is that your uplift doesn't do a great deal and your renewing mist doesn't do a great deal. Despite the buffs to uplift, it's still a little bit on the weak side, and you're kind of chasing your tail a little bit to generate that chi. So that all sounds pretty disastrous, right? It sounds pretty disastrous. Now, what are the good points? What are the good points? There are some good points to this. One, Mistweavers are certainly the most mana efficient at the moment. It definitely seems that way, which means when you bump into some longer fights, probably looking towards 8 to 10 minutes, Mistweavers are going to be gradually pulling and pulling and pulling back ahead, as the Holy Priests and the Resto Druids, certainly in their current incarnation, will probably start running around that point, depending on how good your raid group is. Obviously, this can always be managed, but in general terms, Mistweavers are the most mana efficient and can keep going and going and going, which is quite nice. It's quite a nice ability to have that stalwart fucking foundation, that healer that will just not quit on you. And that's quite nice, that they'll just keep going while other people can take a break, need to do some regen. However, we're going to play it in the ultimate raid scheme of Warlords of Draenor. We've yet to see exactly how it's going to play out, but it'd be very cool to see that happening. That's actually quite nice. Another aspect of this is how the changes to enveloping mist work, and how you're now using your statue really more as a reverse beacon is how it's being described, and I can totally see that, is that your renewing mist, your enveloping mist, sorry, is getting huge buffs from soothing mist, so when you're tank healing, you're actually in a pretty good spot. Your tank healing allows you to do some very cool stuff, and you then, on your statue, is going to be very quickly. You'll notice in the background that the actual statue shoots very quickly between other people to give them healing, while you're putting very effective tank healing in. You can also be very cool at spot healing. There are some strengths here, and still some weaknesses. It's a little worrying that we're getting this close to launch, and still they feel weak. There are lots of down people about the Mistweaver because, of course, you can't get everybody to clump all the time. In fact, I've experienced nearly every mythic raid boss in the game that's coming, and standing in a big ball ain't happening that often. Once in a while, sure. But in general, the bosses are designed with people being spread the hell out as much as possible. And that being able to say, well, as long as everyone clumps, I can do really well. That's great. But we're not clumped up that often, and, you know, that's going to be a big issue. You're going to end up spending your life inside of the melee, maybe, to try and get some bonus done. Do you want that to happen as a healer? Probably not. I guess we should give some mention towards fist weaving, which has kind of died a death, unfortunately, due to the fact that Blizzard seems to have this 50-50 idea in mind, that it should be 50% DPS and 50% healing. That kind of makes you crap at both. It doesn't make you good at anything, and therefore, it ain't great. And that's a little bit sad. It's not good enough at the moment to be sort of doing some fist weaving inside a dungeon. You're just going to be straight up spot healing, which isn't the way Mistweavers are designed. And in a raid, if you can have the time to go 50-50, then you could probably bring another DPS. As simple as that. And a straight up DPS is probably going to be better. It's really that simple. So not great news, guys. I will keep a close eye and see if anything happens, numbers-wise. But mechanically, given how it works, it's not the best. It's really not the best. But considering the mechanics tuning is done, numbers tuning ain't going to do that much for it. And you might be looking at a particularly clunky healer here. And whether or not that suits you, and you'll kind of stick to your guns and being your main, that's fine. But I can see why a lot of people are considering moving over to other healing specs that aren't risking being bench warmers and aren't risking, and I say risking because there's a high risk that you will simply be flat out outdone in most of the niches that are required. Do we need more AoE healing? We're probably going to bring some more Resto Druids and Shaman. Do we need more tank healing? Other classes do that better. And that seems to be the big issue right now, is mechanically, numbers aren't going to solve the actual mechanical issues that I just talked about earlier on. Alright guys, so that's how it's working out right now. I wish it was better news, but that's, you know, honesty is the best policy. Alright guys, bye-bye.